Tulis. Grandma Yellen continues to propose her poisons. We are hearing her voice on America's First News today. We are Nooga Radio. Do tune in every morning to America's First News with the Sean Hannity station. Sean is on at 3. And before him, filling the airwaves with the most jabbing sports analysis is Colin Cowherd. This is David Tulis. I thank you for giving me just a couple minutes of your time here today. We argue that near is better than far, small than big, and simple than complex. And Nooga centrism will fire it's on automatic, even in the footnotes at 5-point type. And there we aver and allege and declare and swear that personal is better than corporate and that physical is better than abstract. Go to Nooganomics.com today. I hope to get to it, but there's a terrific analysis of the First Amendment vis-a-vis the police. And I make mention of the 2014 April protest in town by the National Socialists. These are people who are blood brothers with Republicans and Democrats, but they have a kind of Nazi flavor. And as I point out in that story, which I urge you to read if you have forgotten, the main demonstration was not by them, but by the police. It was a peaceful event, however, though we are reading about extraordinary police violence against the people. And the question is, what about the freedom of speech under the First Amendment? This is being chipped away by the state. And so the solution to these abuses is to look, as well, Basil Marceau would look at the legal foundation of policing in his pending challenges to it. But we need to look at the idea of reform. And I am proposing here at Nooga Radio that the Mayor Burke, Andy Burke, look at his new chief and say, I want reform. I want training turned upside down. I want most of the training to be about talking and negotiation. I want there to be officers who go about without guns, who don't look like military people. I want officers to be, I want half the police force to be unarmed and wear civilian-like clothing without the threat attached to the officer as he stands now. There are nearly 500 sworn cops in Chattanooga. The word cop comes from citizen on patrol. And the mayor, who would do very well with his base, and whose party would do very well with its base, if they said, let's have reform, even though all three candidates, I think, have not much interest in that. As far as I can tell, the reporting has not been going into the kind of detail I look at, and I just haven't had time. Being a small business person, right? I haven't had time to look into the details, but maybe soon I'll have more time to help you, my listener, have a better understanding of how things should be. General A.P. Stewart, I want to say a couple things about him. I know that to the NAACP, these things are just dicta. In other words, they're just, it's like a dicta would be the dissenting opinion in a Supreme Court case, right? It's just dicta. There may be some fine words in the dissent, but they're all of no effect, really no power. But General Stewart was a courageous soldier. There's a great little detail that comes from a story that I read about him this morning at TennesseeHistory.com, a brief essay covering his life and highlighting a few things. He was anti-secessionist. He was anti-slavery. Well, then why did he fight in the war? Well, he fought in the war because he believed in the right of self-determination and that states being independent sovereignties, independent states, right? They weren't departments of Washington. They were self-contained states that had yielded certain privileges and powers to the national power under the Constitution, and also earlier in the Confederation. And so there was no ordering them around at all. So he believed in self-government and government by a state of its own people and by its elected representatives. So that's why he fought. He fought understanding that the moral tariff was wicked and that the cartels in New England, were trying to maintain their businesses against competition by raising that tariff. It's like 50% tariff on imports. And so there were other reasons. The war was not about slavery, as commonly said. This is the established argument put in to the head and mind of every student, that the war was about slavery. It was not about slavery. It only became about slavery about 2.5 years into it. when the Yankee and their president said this is a way we can win international support by being virtuous and righteous, saying that the war is about freeing, emancipating the Negro in the southern in his southern chains. Right. But General Stewart, at one point, he was crossing a river, and there was a cannon being pulled across, and by horse, and it got bogged down in the mud, and it couldn't be moved. So he didn't think about what he was going to do. He just threw his reins to an aide, and he waded it out in the creek, and he put his shoulder on the wheel, and then he said, "Oh, men, together!" And then he pushed the wheels out of the trough and the weapon onto the bank. He was very modest, very shy man. He always put the needs of his men ahead of his own. And they proved themselves again and again. They were a very good fighting force. The toughest battle he fought was here in the Chattanooga area, in the Battle of Chickamauga. He ran into trouble, and there was a great charge. And he at one point rode his horse through some Yellow Jackets, and they got him badly. But he just got back up on his horse and kept going. And there was in the battle there was some rifle fire from the Union side. And he called out. He called out. Now, Father, he's talking to the family men who are in the line. You promised Mother that you would not expose yourself today. So this just generated some howls of laughter. And as he went down the line to encourage his men, the saying preceded him. It went so fast down the line there, just about at the time of the Battle of New Hope Church. And he was told that by his general, General Johnston, if I can make you a lieutenant general for your management, then you shall have it. So he became a general, one of only 2 Tennesseans to earn the rank of lieutenant general in the Confederate Army. So again, that's why there's a monument to him. He was a celebrated soldier, and victorious even in defeat. Even in defeat, he won. He always won, even though his men were oppressed sometimes and defeated, especially later under General Hood. Hood was kind of a suicidal general who didn't count the lives of his men of great value. But General Stewart was cool-headed under fire. It is said he inspired his men. He had 3 horses shot out from under him at the Battle of Resaca, just south of Chattanooga, and he maintained always the respect of his subordinates. There was a comment by General Hood. He said he admired the Tennessean for his cheering of his command by riding among them before every battle, talking with and encouraging them toward the bloody work ahead. As an example of the consideration for his men, I have seen him when we were on the march and halted by the roadside to rest, and he wished to pass through the lines of tired men lying or sitting by the road. Most politely asked the men to make room for him and his staff to get through, and then to ride through slowly and carefully, lest the horses trample some of them. So that's General A.P. Stewart. After the war, he was a professor of mathematics at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, and in 1874, he was elected president of the university, made some faculty reforms, and he helped make it one of the best universities in the South. He's looked upon in the region as a historian, and that's where he made his name in the park creation business after the war. He worked diligently to ensure the battlefields collected were the most strategic positions of the battle and reflected the sacrifice of both, now get this, both the Confederate and the Union soldiers who fought in the battle. And there's a large-mindedness there that we're not seeing on the part of Quinston Coleman and Gloria Sweet Love, the Tennessee NAACP person quoted in recent stories on TV9. TV9 has covered this story, I think, very well, and it has the account that came out yesterday. In 1918, this former general, Confederate general, was memorialized by the Chattanooga Daughters of the Confederacy, I guess. And the artist, again, of that monument down by the courthouse downtown in Chattanooga is by, I believe it's a woman, Belle Kinney, B-E-L-L-E, Kinney is the name of the sculptor, and it was cast in the Tiffany Studios in New York. Now, he was a man who was against the war. He was against the idea of secession, as General Lee was. And he was also against slavery. And it just goes to show you that though he didn't own slaves, he was a common man. He had a wife and children. He did not own people directly. Yet he fought in a cause, in a noble cause that failed. Right, it failed. And in fact, the war against the South, the decimation of the South by General Sherman and others, when they finally massed their forces and finally just overwhelmed the Southern forces with great wickedness. There were churches burned. There were women raped. The rules of war were rejected. And in fact, the rules of war that were practiced by General Sherman were studied by the Germans. And that's where the Germans got some of their concept of total war. This was about prior to World War I and also prior to World War II. The American annihilation of the South, of its own Southland, was studied by German writers and historians as a way of gleaning the lessons for the expansion of that like empire that rose in the 20s and 30s, the National Socialist Empire, which, except for its anti-Jewish flavor, is very similar to the one we have here. The American expansionist empire is almost identical administratively to that of the German National Socialist Party. And so what we have in the attack on this monument, we have effectively an effort to revise history and not to have that monument represent something that is perhaps a doleful reminder of the past. Right, the NAACP should rather than say it should come down and join in a kind of hysteria, I suggest it should say, well, this man had many Christian virtues. He was a good man. He was not a slave owner. He was against slavery. He was against secession. But the callings of his time and the web of his surroundings and his connections and his context really required him to take part. Given that he was a military man, he really had to make a choice between the North and the South. And honorable men chose the South, right? And they were defending hearth and home. They were defending their homeland. And don't we, as Black people, want that to be our case as well? Don't we want to defend our homeland? Don't we want to be self-governing? Don't we want to be cities, counties, states that govern themselves, or do we want to be owned by strangers? And that's what has happened to the Black man today. He's owned by strangers. He's owned by bureaucracies. He's owned by the police. Your average young Black man, late 20s, I'm thinking of Hanson Melvin, stopped 20 to 30 to 40 times. We have a city councilman, Anthony Byrd. He's been stopped by police just because he's Black 30, 40, 50 times. He said he couldn't tell me how many times he has been stopped just for driving while Black or walking while Black. Does that happen to me? Well, no, it doesn't happen to white people. It happens to Black people. Because they are viewed in a proprietary sense by police officers around the country. Are no goods, Blacks are lazy, Blacks are criminal. You cannot have a good Black person. Many people in the police departments around the country say and think. There's a story about the Bakersfield girl on her bike pausing in the street to drink from a bottle of water, and she had gone to a store to buy a Father's Day gift in June, just a few weeks ago. And she was stopped. She was thrown to the ground. She was beaten up. A police dog, mauled her. The police were looking for a bearded man whom they thought had a machete. That's who they were looking for. And this incredible video made by the NAACP in Bakersfield, Texas, describes in a very moving way what happened in the course of about 4 or 5 minutes. Why do we have these kinds of things happening? No Black man in the Old South would ever have been treated like that. No Black girl would ever have been treated like that by the foreman of the plantation or the owner of the plantation. Blacks are treated that way. They're treated probably 15 times worse than they were in the South. By what? By the modern state, the savior state, the Washington, D.C. state, the Nashville state. These are these and their agents through state corporations such as municipal governments, right? They are the source and the ideology that makes Black people and the poor ground to powder in the industrial judicial complex. Make sure you go to Nooganomics.com today and read our analysis, thanks to the work of John Whitehead, the constitutional attorney in Charlottesville, Virginia, about this whole phenomenon. Which I would say, if you're the NAACP, you need to be doing what I do. to defend black people. You need to call for reform. The NAACP has not called for reform. We have an opening here with the retirement from the scene of Chief Fred Fletcher, and the NAACP has said nothing about reform. Nothing. It has said nothing. It has not read my work. It has not heard this show that you, my listener, are giving a couple of minutes to. It does not pay attention to the urgent need for reform in Chattanooga. And it has given its own favor of one of the candidates that the committee named by the mayor did, in fact, pick. That's Chief McPherson. He was on the NAACP list as the #1 candidate. So they have that to be glad about. But is Chief McPherson part of the problem? Is he part? Has he sort of turned against his own people by being in the police department? That is the question that I would ask you, my listener. And I ask you, my listener, to ask that question of your local authority, your city council member. What can you ask the mayor? If you have an interview with the mayor, can you ask him this question? Now, on the matter of police abuse and the First Amendment, there's a great quote in the Nooganomics.com post today. It's from a journalist, Brad Hicks. The year 2011, St. Louis. Here's an Occupy St. Louis activist protest, and here's what happened. Here is what happened. The cops didn't show up in riot gear and helmets. Well, they showed up in shirt sleeves with their faces showing. They not only didn't show up with SWAT gear, they showed up with no unusual weapons at all. And what weapons they had were securely holstered. They politely woke everybody up. They politely helped everybody who was willing to remove their property from the park to do so. They then asked, out of the 75 to 100 people down there, how many people were volunteering to be arrested for being arrested duty. Given 33 hours to think about it and 10 hours to sweat it over, 27 volunteered. As the police already knew, these people's legal advisors had advised them not to even passively resist. So those 27 people lined up to be peacefully arrested and were escorted away by a handful of cops. The rest were advised to please continue the protest over there on the sidewalk. And what happened next was the most absolutely brilliant piece of crowd control policing I have ever heard of in my entire lifetime. All the cops who weren't busy transporting and processing the voluntary arrestees lined up, blocking the stairs down into the plaza. They stood shoulder to shoulder. They kept calm and silent. They positioned the weapons on their belts out of sight. They crossed their hands low in front of them in exactly the least provocative posture known to man. And they peacefully, silently, respectfully occupied the plaza using exactly the same nonviolent techniques that the protesters themselves had been trained in. That's a wonderful example. And it's a contrast to a quote in today's Nooganomics.com from an LAPD officer, Sunil Dutta. Now, I mentioned NAACP should make note that the LAPD is a very violent organization, And one of the candidates for mayor in Chattanooga, for chief of police in Chattanooga, is from that department, a SWAT guy who has gotten involved in law enforcement against the homeless. Here's what Officer Sunil Dutta said. If you don't want to get shot, tased, pepper sprayed, struck with a baton, or thrown to the ground, just do what I tell you. Don't argue with me. Don't call me names. Don't tell me that I can't stop you. Don't say I'm a racist pig. Don't threaten that you'll sue me and take away my badge. Don't scream at me if you pay my salary. And don't even think of aggressively walking towards me. Well, that's hardly community policing with the comply or die thinking that we have today. And the rationale, John Whitehead says, goes like this. Do exactly what I tell you and we'll get along fine. Do not question me or talk back in any way. You do not have the right to object to anything I may say or ask you to do, or ask for clarification if my demands are unclear or contradictory. You must obey me under all circumstances without hesitation, no matter how arbitrary, unreasonable, discriminatory, or blatantly racist my commands may be. Anything other than immediate, perfect, servile compliance will be labeled as resisting arrest and expose you to the possibility of a violent reaction from me. That reaction could cause you severe injury or even death. And I will suffer no consequences. It's your choice, comply or die. That's what we have. Now, let me ask you this. Are black people freer in the Old South, or are they freer today? Do we have liberty and freedom today under our national republic and under this sort of occupation by the law and the state. I think that in some respects, black people had it better in the Old South. In fact, I was just looking at Ira Berlin's book, Masters Without Slaves, 1978, about the many, many tens of thousands of freed blacks in the South. They bought their freedom. And though they were in a tenuous legal position, they had it in many ways better than black people have it today. And who fought this idea of national government? Who fought the idea of unitary and consolidated government that drafts people, that taxes people illegally, that brings the militarization of Chattanooga Police Department, of Hamilton County Police Department? Who fights that entity? Well, people who are putting statues down in front of the county courthouse, namely General A.P. Stewart. General A.P. Stewart fighting tyranny, fighting terrorism in 1860s. David Tulis.
The Tennessee Valley's news, talk, and sports leader,